Classical poetry. 1. The morning star of song who made his music heard below, Don Chaucer, the first warbler, whose sweet breath preluded those melodious bursts that fill the spacious times of great Elizabeth, with sounds that echo still to Geoffrey Chaucer, 1340 to 1400 before William Shakespeare. Geoffrey Chaucer was the preeminent English poet, and he remains in the top tier of the English canon. He was also the most significant poet to write in Middle English. Chaucer was born in the early 1340s to a fairly rich, well-to-do, though not aristocratic family. His father, John Chaucer, was a vintner and deputy to the king's butler. His family's financial success came from work in the wine and leather businesses, and they had considerable inherited property in London. Little information exists about Chaucer's education, but his writings demonstrate a close familiarity with a number of important books of his contemporaries and of earlier times, such as Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy. Chaucer likely was fluent in several languages, including French, Italian, and Latin. Sons of wealthy London merchants could receive good educations at this time, and there is reason to believe that, if Chaucer did not attend one of the schools on Thames Street near his boyhood home, then he was at least well educated at home. Certainly his work showcases a passion for reading a huge range of literature, classical and modern. Chaucer first appears in public records in 1357 as a member of the House of Elizabeth, Countess of Ulster. This was a conventional arrangement in which sons of middle-class households were placed in royal service so that they could obtain a courtly education. 2 years later, Chaucer served in the army under Edward III and was captured during an unsuccessful offensive at Rheims, although he was later ransomed. Chaucer served under a number of diplomatic missions. By 1366 Chaucer had married Philippa Pan, who had been in service with the Countess of Ulster. Chaucer married well for his position, for Philippa Chaucer received pension from the Queen Consort of Edward III. Philippa's sister Catherine de Rote was John of Gaunt's mistress for 20 years before becoming the Duke's wife. Through this connection, John of Gaunt was Chaucer's kinsman. Chaucer himself secured an annuity as yeoman of the king and was listed as one of the king's esquires. Chaucer's first published work was the Book of the Duchess, a poem of over 1,300 lines, supposed to be an elegy for Blanche, Duchess of Lancaster, addressed to her widower, the Duke. For this first of his important poems, which was published in 1370, Chaucer used the dream vision form, a genre made popular by the highly influential 13th-century French poem of courtly love, the Roman de la Rose, which Chaucer translated into English. Throughout the following decade, Chaucer continued with his diplomatic career, traveling to Italy for negotiations to open a Genoa port to Britain as well as military negotiations with Milan. During his missions to Italy, Chaucer encountered the work of Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, which were later to have profound influence upon his own writing. In 1374 Chaucer was appointed Controller of the Customs and Subsidy of Wool, Skins, and Tanned Hides for the Port of London, his first position away from the British court. Chaucer's only major work during this period was House of Fame, a poem of around 2,000 lines in dream vision form, which ends so abruptly that some scholars consider it unfinished. In October 1385, Chaucer was appointed a Justice of the Peace for Kent, and in August 1386 he became Knight of the Shire for Kent. Around the time of his wife's death in 1387, Chaucer moved to Greenwich and later to Kent. Changing political circumstances eventually led to Chaucer falling out of favour with the royal court and leaving Parliament, but when Richard II became King of England, Chaucer regained royal favour. During this period Chaucer used writing primarily as an escape from public life. His works included Parlement of Fowls, a poem of 699 lines. This work is a dream vision for St. Valentine's Day that makes use of the myth that each year on that day the birds gather before the goddess Nature to choose their mates. This work was heavily influenced by Boccaccio and Dante. Chaucer's next work was Troilus and Chryside, which was influenced by the Consolation of Philosophy, which Chaucer himself translated into English. Chaucer took some of the plot of Troilus from Boccaccio's Philostrato. This 8,000-line rhyme royal poem recounts the love story of Troilus, son of the Trojan king Priam, and Chryseide, widowed daughter of the deserter priest Calchas, against the background of the Trojan War. Compare Shakespeare's version in Troilus and Cressida. The Canterbury Tales secured Chaucer's literary reputation. It is his great literary accomplishment, a compendium of stories by pilgrims travelling to the shrine of Thomas a Becket in Canterbury. Chaucer introduces each of these pilgrims in vivid, brief sketches in the general prologue and intersperses the 24 tales with short dramatic scenes with lively exchanges. Chaucer did not complete the full plan for the tales, and surviving manuscripts leave some doubt as to the exact order of the tales that remain. However, the work is sufficiently complete to be considered a unified book rather than a collection of unfinished fragments. The Canterbury Tales is a lively mix of a variety of genres told by travelers from all aspects of society. Among the genres included are courtly romance, fabliaux, saint's biography, allegorical tale, beast fable, and medieval sermon. Information concerning Chaucer's descendants is not fully clear. It is likely that he and Philippa had 2 sons and 2 daughters. Thomas Chaucer died in 1400. He was a large landowner and political office holder, and his daughter, Alice, became Duchess of Suffolk. Little is known about Lewis Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer's youngest son. Of Chaucer's 2 daughters, Elizabeth became a nun, while Agnes was a lady-in-waiting for the coronation of Henry IV in 1399. Public records indicate that Chaucer had no descendants living after the 15th century. The age of Chaucer, 1340–1400, Introduction, for a profound and comprehensive study of an author's literary work is required, among other things, a thorough understanding of the age which produced and nurtured him. Without acquaintance with the historical context, our evaluation and apprehension of literature is bound to be lopsided, if not altogether warped and garbled. Every man is a child of his age. He is influenced by it, though, if he is a great man, he may influence it also. A great writer like Shakespeare or Chaucer is generally said to be not of an age, but of all ages. But, in spite of his universal appeal, the fact remains that even he could not have escaped the spirit of the age in which he lived and moved and had his being. For understanding him and his works in their fullness, it is imperative to familiarize ourselves with the influential currents of thought and feeling and sensibility, not to speak of the socio-politico-economic conditions obtaining in the times in which he flourished. Probably the reverse of it is also true. We may acquire some understanding of these tendencies and currents, the ethos of the age, through the writer himself. Emphasizing this point, W. H. Hudson says, "Every man belongs to his race and age. No matter how marked his personality, the spirit of his race and age finds expression through him." The same critic expresses the relationship between history and literature. He says, "Ordinary English history is our nation's biography, its literature is its autobiography. In the one we read the story of its actions and practical achievements, in the other the story of its intellectual and moral development." Though Chaucer transcends the limits of his generation and creates something which is of interest to the future generation too, yet he represents much of what his age stands for. And therein lies his greatness. Chaucer's age, both medieval and modern, Chaucer's age, like most historical ages, was an age of transition. This transition implies a shift from the medieval to the modern times, the emergence of the English nation from the Dark Ages to the Age of Enlightenment. Though some elements associated with modernity were coming into prominence, yet mostly and essentially the age was medieval, unscientific, superstitious, chivalrous, religious-minded, and backward in most respects. The 14th century, as J. M. Manley puts it in the Cambridge History of English Literature, was a dark epoch in the history of England. However, the silver lining of modernity did succeed in piercing, here and there, the thick darkness of ignorance and superstition. In fact, the age of Chaucer was not stagnant, stationary. It was inching its way steadily and surely to the dawn of the Renaissance and the Reformation, which were yet a couple of centuries ahead. Robert Dudley French observes, "It was an age of restlessness, amid the ferment, excitement, of new life that Chaucer lived and wrote." Old things and new appear side by side upon his pages, and in his poetry we can study the essential spirit, both of the age that was passing and of the age that was to come. What are these old things and new, and what made the age restless? The answer will be provided if we discuss the chief events and features of the age. The 100 Years' War, the period between 1337 and 1453, is marked by a long succession of skirmishes between France and England, which are collectively known as the 100 Years' War. Under the able and warlike guidance of King Edward III, 1327 to 1377, England won a number of glorious victories, particularly at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. The French might beaten, and Edward was once acknowledged even the King of France. But later, after his demise and with the succession of the incompetent Richard II, the English might waned and the French were able to secure tangible gains. The war influenced the English character in the following two ways: the fostering of nationalistic sentiment, and the demolition of some social barriers between different classes of society. It was obviously natural for the conflict to have engendered among the English a strong feeling of national solidarity and patriotic fervour. But, as Compton Rickett reminds us, the fight is memorable not merely for stimulating the pride of English men. It is important, too, for the second reason given above. It was not the aristocracy alone which secured the victory for England. The aristocracy was vitally supported by the lowly archers whose feats with the bow were a force to reckon with. Froissart, the French chronicler, referring to the English archers, says, "They let fly their arrows so wholly five together and so thick that it seemed snow." The recognition of the services of the humble archers brought in a note of democratization in the country, and the age-old Iron Curtain between the nobility and the proletariat developed a few chinks. This was an advance from medievalism to modernism. The age of chivalry, nevertheless, the dawn of the modern era was yet far away. Compton Rickett observes, Chaucer's England is still characteristically medieval, and nowhere is the conservative feeling more strongly marked than in the persistence of chivalry. This strange amalgam of love, war, and religion, so far from exhibiting any signs of decay, reached perhaps its fullest development at this time. More than 2 centuries were to elapse before it was finally killed by the satirical pen of Cervantes. The knight in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is typical of his kind. Even the tale he narrates concerns the adventures of 2 true knights, Arcite and Palamon. The Black Death, peasants' revolt, and labor unrest. In the age of Chaucer, most people were victims of poverty, uncleanliness, and filth epidemic. Even well-educated nobles eyed soap with suspicion, and learned physicians often forbade bathing as harmful for health. That is why England was often visited by epidemics, especially plague. The severest attack of this dread epidemic came in 1348. It was called the Black Death because black, knotty boils appeared on the bodies of the hopeless victims. It is estimated that about 1 million human beings were swept away by this epidemic. That roughly makes 1/3 of the total population of England at that time. One immediate consequence of this pestilence was the acute shortage of working hands. The socio-economic system of England lay hopelessly paralyzed. Labourers and villains who happened started demanding much higher wages. But neither their employers nor the king nor parliament was ready to meet these demands. A number of severe regulations were passed asking workers to work at the old rates of payment. This occasioned a great deal of resentment, which culminated in the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 during the reign of Richard II. The peasants, groaning under the weight of injustice and undue official severity, were led to London by the Kentish priest John Ball. He preached the dignity of labour and asked the nobles, when Adam Delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The king, overawed, pressurized by the mass of peasantry armed with such weapons as hatchets, spades, and pitchforks, promised reform but later shelved his promise. The Peasants' Revolt is, according to Compton Rickett, a dim foreshadowing of those industrial troubles that lay in the distant future. Chaucer in his Nun's Priest's Tale refers to Jack Straw, who with Wat Tyler raised the banner of revolt. K. Root thus sums up the significance of this uprising. This revolt, suppressed by the courage and good judgment of the boy king, Richard II, though barren of any direct and immediate result, exerted a lasting influence on the temper of the lower classes, fostering in them a spirit of independence which made them no longer a negligible quantity in the life of the nation. This was another line of progress towards modernism. The Church, in the age of Chaucer, the Church became a hotbed of profligacy, corruption, and materialism. The overlord of the Church, namely, the Pope of Rome, himself had ambitions and aptitudes other than spiritual. W. H. Hudson maintains in this connection, of spiritual zeal and energy very little was now left in the country. The greater prelates heaped up wealth, and lived in a godless and worldly way. The rank and file of the clergy were ignorant and careless. The mendicant friars were notorious for their greed and profligacy. John Gower, a contemporary of Chaucer, whom he calls Moral Gower, on account of his didactic tendency, thus pictures the condition of the Church in his prologue to Confessio Amantis: Lo, thus ye broke is Christ's foldy, whereof the flock without guide devoured is on every side, in lacks of hem that been erway in shepherds, which her wit beware upon the world in other half. Another contemporary has to say this about the priests: our priests are now become blind, dark, and beclouded. There is neither shaven crown on their head, nor modesty in their words, nor temperance in their food, nor even chastity in their deeds. If this was the condition of the ecclesiasts, we can easily imagine that of the laity. Well does Chaucer say in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, "If gold rust, what iron shall do?" Chaucer himself was indifferent to any reform, but his character sketches of the ecclesiastical figures in the Canterbury Tales leave no uncertainty regarding the corruption which had crept into the ecclesiastical rank and file. The round-bellied Epicurean monk, the merry and devil-may-care friar, and the unscrupulous pardoner are fairly typical of his age. This widespread and deep-rooted corruption had already begun to provoke the attention of some reformists, the most prominent of whom was John Wycliffe, 13,207–84, who has been called the morning star of the Reformation. He started what is called the Lollards' movement. His aim was to eradicate the evil and corruption which had become a part and parcel of the Church. He sent his poor priests to all parts of the country for spreading his message of simplicity, purity, and austerity. His self-appointed task was to take Christianity back to its original purity and spirituality. He exhorted people not to have anything to do with the corrupt ministers of the Pope, and to have faith only in the Word of God as enshrined in the Bible, to make the teaching of the Bible accessible to the common masses. He, with the help of some of his disciples, translated the Bible from Latin into the native tongue. He also wrote a number of tracts embodying his teaching. His translation of the Bible was, in the words of W. H. Hudson, the first translation of the Scriptures into any modern vernacular tongue. That Chaucer was sympathetic to the Lollards movement is evident from the element of idealization which characterizes his portrait of the poor parson in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. The movement launched by Wycliffe and his followers in the age of Chaucer was an adumbration of the Reformation which was to come in the 16th century to wean England from the papal influence. Literary and intellectual tendencies, Latin and French were the dominant languages in 14th century England. However, in the later half of the century English came to its own, thanks to the sterling work done by Chaucer and some others like Langland, Gower, and Wycliffe, who wrote in English and wrote well. The English language itself was in a fluid state of being, and was divided into a number of dialects. 7. The universities of Cambridge and Oxford employed Latin as the medium of instruction. Latin was also the language of the fashionable, who cultivated it as a social necessity. We recall here Chaucer's summoner who wold speak no word but Latin, after having drunk well. The contribution of Chaucer towards the standardization and popularization of the English language cannot be overestimated. As regards his contribution to English poetry, he has well been characterized as the father of English poetry. No doubt there were other poets contemporaneous with him, Langland, Gower, and a few more, but Chaucer is as head and shoulders among them as Shakespeare is among the Elizabethan dramatists. He stands like a majestic oak in a shrubbery. The English prose, too, was coming to itself. Mandeville's travelogues and Wycliffe's reformative pamphlets give one a feeling that the English prose was on its way to standardization and popular acclamation. In another way, too, the age of Chaucer stands between the medieval and the modern life. There was in this age some sort of a minor renaissance. The dawn of the real Renaissance in England was yet about 2 centuries ahead, yet in the age of Chaucer there are signs of growing influence of the ancients on native literature. Chaucer's own poetry was influenced by the Italian writer Boccaccio, 1313–75, and to a lesser extent, Petrarch, 1304–74. The frameworks of Boccaccio's Decameron and of Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales are almost similar. However, it is somewhat doubtful if Chaucer had read the Italian writer. It was through the work of the 2 above-named Italian writers that humanism made its way into English intellectual culture. Well does Compton Rickett observe, Chaucer's world is medieval, but beneath his medievalism the leaven of the Renaissance is already at work. Literary influences on Chaucer's poetry. It is convenient to divide Chaucer's literary output into 3 stages, which show 3 distinct influences on the development of his poetry. The French period. Chaucer's early poetry was directly influenced by contemporary French poetry. He composed in his wild youthful days a number of love poems, none of which have survived, but which gave him some fame as a poet. It is supposed that A Prayer to the Virgin is the first of his extant poems. He translated some portions of the famous French work Roman de la Rose, an elaborate love allegory. Its translation helped Chaucer to fashion his style. He cultivated an allegorical style. He learned from French poetry the charm of fluent simplicity, complete correspondence of words and thoughts, constant restraint in the expression of emotion and satire. Chaucer wrote in 1369 the Book of Duchessy on the death of Blanche, John of Gaunt's wife. It is an allegory in the manner of reigning French school, but Chaucer gave his elegy freshness and seeming sincerity. The Italian period, 1372–1384. Chaucer's Italian period is characterized by variety and new technical innovations in his poetry. During his visits to Italy, Chaucer saw a new world of art and literature which had reached an astonishing excellence. He read Dante's Divine Commedia, Petrarch's Sonnets, and Boccaccio's Decameron. In Italy, he saw the dawn of Renaissance, which, to some extent, influenced his poetry, which is secular and humanistic in spirit. Moody and Lovett remark, the unquenchable curiosity of the men of Renaissance was his, more than a century before the Renaissance really began to affect England. He, too, shared their thirst for expression. The great books he had come to know in Italy gave no peace until he should equal or surpass them. The important works which he produced in emulation of the Italian masters are the House of Fame, the Parliament of Fowls, Troilus and Chryside, and the Legend of Good Women. The House of Fame, 1382, is a dream allegory which shows Dante's influence. It is remarkable for the rare combination of lofty thought and simple, homely language, and the presentation of genuine Chaucerian humor. The Legend of Good Women, 1385, the unfinished work, was originally planned to contain 19 tales of virtuous women of antiquity. But in the extant volume it consists of 8 accomplished tales and the 9th only begun. It is conspicuous for its masterly narrative, particularly in the portion dealing with Cleopatra, and the skillful handling of the heroic couplet in English for the first time. Troilus and Chryside is founded on Boccaccio's Philostrato. It marks a significant development in Chaucer's poetic career. He uses his material very freely and with great artistic ability. In it he reflects the ideals of his own age and society, and so gives to the whole story a dramatic force and beauty which it had never known before. The characters of Chryside and Pandarus reveal a new subtlety of psychological development, and reveal Chaucer's growing insight into human motives. Troilus and Chryside is considered as Chaucer's best narrative work. The rhyme royal stanza is used with much deftness and beauty. Chaucer also wrote the story of Griselda, the Clerk's Tale, and the story of Constance during this period. The English period, 1384, 1390. In this period Chaucer becomes independent, relying upon himself entirely even for the use which he puts his own borrowed themes. A few smaller poems which belong to this period are Former Age, Fortune, Truth, Gentleness and the Lack of Steadfastness, but the crowning and monumental work of this period is the Canterbury Tales. The plan of the Canterbury Tales. The plan of the Tales was probably adopted soon after 1386, in which year Chaucer composed the prologue to the Legend of Good Women. They are not, and cannot be looked on as a whole. Many were written independently, and they fitted into the framework of the prologue. Many which he intended to write were never written. The whole existing body of the tales was completed before the close of 1390. The composition of the general prologue to the tales is commonly associated with 1387. The manner in which Chaucer knitted the tales together was very simple, and likely to please the English people. The Canterbury Tales is a collection of 24 tales in verse and prose, some incomplete, told as entertainment by a group of pilgrims riding from London to the shrine of Thomas A. Becket at Canterbury. Chaucer had probably made the pilgrimage to Canterbury in the spring of 1385 or 1387, and was led by this experience to the framework in which he set his pictures of life. For the general idea of the tales Chaucer was indebted to Boccaccio, but in nearly every important feature the work is essentially English. To realize his purpose Chaucer grouped around the jovial host of the Tabard in 29 pilgrims, including himself, of every class of society in England. He sat them on horseback to ride to Canterbury and home again, intending to make each of them tell tales. But the company never reaches Canterbury, and only 23 pilgrims get their turn. Some tales are left unfinished. There are 2 prose tales, Chaucer's own tale of Meliboeus and the Parson's Tale. The rest of the tales are composed in the decasyllabic or heroic couplet. 9. In the famous prologue, Chaucer makes us acquainted with the various characters of his drama. The 29 characters are carefully chosen types, who represent various segments of contemporary society. Endowed with creative imagination, Chaucer individualized his characters. All of them are fully realized figures, with an importance of their own. F.N. Robinson remarks about Chaucer's characters, Chaucer's pilgrims are far more vivid and personal than the medieval figures with which they have been compared. William J. Long also remarks, Chaucer is the first English writer to bring the atmosphere of romantic interest about the men and women and the daily work of one's own world, which is the aim of nearly all modern literature. Chaucer assigned to a pilgrim a tale suited to his character and vocation. The tales are of astonishing variety and give us a true and faithful picture of differing aspects of medieval life in England. Stopford A. Brooke remarks, the tales themselves take in the whole range of the poetry and the life of the Middle Ages, the legend of the saint, the romance of the knight, the wonderful fables of the traveller, the coarse tale of common life, the love story, the allegory, the animal fable and the satirical lay. Chaucer emerges as the first great storyteller in verse in the Canterbury Tales. All the best tales are told easily, gracefully, and sincerely. The tales are remarkable for the dramatic quality. F.N. Robinson says, in fact the pilgrimage is a continuous and lively drama, in which the stories contribute to the action. Because of this sustained dramatic interest and the vivid reality of characters, as well as for the inclusive representation of English society, the Canterbury Tales has been called a human comedy. The implied comparison with Balzac's great series of stories of the life of modern France is not inappropriate. In the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer made English into a true means of poetry and literature. He developed the resources of English language for literary use, and set an example which was followed by a long line of poets. In Tales, Chaucer appears as a great humorist who has a consummate knowledge of human life. His humor is rich, tolerant, profound, and sane, devoid of spite and cynicism. He also had a keen sense of pathos in human life. He can bring tears into our eyes, and he can make us smile or be sad as he pleases. The Canterbury Tales is the first finest poetic testament of England. It has coherence and imaginative drive of a great work of literature, and presents a firmly realized view of life. Of all medieval poems, the Canterbury Tales gives a modern reader the strongest sense of contact with the life and manners of 14th century England. Background to the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales is at once one of the most famous and most frustrating works of literature ever written. Since its composition in late 1300s, critics have continued to mine new riches from its complex ground, and started new arguments about the text and its interpretation. Chaucer's richly detailed text, so Dryden said, was God's plenty, and the rich variety of the tales is partly perhaps the reason for its success. It is both one long narrative of the pilgrims and their pilgrimage, and an encyclopedia of shorter narratives. It is both one large drama and a compilation of most literary forms known to 10 medieval literature: romance, fabliau, Breton lay, moral fable, verse romance, beast fable, prayer to the Virgin, and so the list goes on. No single literary genre dominates the tales. The tales include romantic adventures, fabliaux, saints' biographies, animal fables, religious allegories, and even a sermon, and range in tone from pious, moralistic tales to lewd and vulgar sexual farces. More often than not, moreover, the specific tone of the tale is extremely difficult to firmly pin down. This, indeed, is down to one of the key problems of interpreting the tales themselves: voice. How do we ever know who is speaking? Because Chaucer, early in the tales, promises to repeat the exact words and style of each speaker as best he can remember it, there is always a tension between Chaucer and the pilgrims. Voice. He ventriloquizes as he retells his tale, even that Chaucer, who is a character on the pilgrim, has a distinct and deliberately Chaucerian voice. Is it the merchant's voice and the merchant's opinion, or Chaucer's? Is it Chaucer the character or Chaucer the writer? If it is Chaucer's, we suppose to take it at face value, or view it ironically. No one knows for certain when Chaucer began to write the tales. The pilgrimage is usually dated 1387, but that date is subject to much scholarly argument, but it is certain that Chaucer wrote some parts of the tales at different times, and went back and added tales to the melting pot. The Knight's Tale, for example, was almost certainly written earlier than the Canterbury Project as a separate work, and then adapted into the voice of the knight, and the Second Nun's Tale, as well as probably the monks, probably have a similar compositional history. Chaucer drew from a rich variety of literary sources to create the tales, though his principal debt is likely to Boccaccio's Decameron, in which 10 nobles from Florence, to escape the plague, stay in a country villa and amuse each other by each telling tales. Boccaccio likely had a significant influence on Chaucer. The Knight's Tale was an English version of a tale by Boccaccio, while 6 of Chaucer's tales have possible sources in the Decameron: the Miller's Tale, the Reeves, the Clerks, the Merchants, the Franklins, and the Shipmans. However, Chaucer's pilgrims to Canterbury form a wider range of society compared to Boccaccio's elite storytellers, allowing for greater differences in tone and substance. The text of the tales itself does not survive complete, but in 10 fragments. Due to the fact that there are no links made between these 10 fragments in most cases, it is extremely difficult to ascertain precisely in which order Chaucer wanted the tales to be read. Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Summary. When April comes with his sweet, fragrant showers, which pierce the dry ground of March, and bathe every root of every plant in sweet liquid, then people desire to go on pilgrimages. Thus begins the famous opening to the Canterbury Tales. The narrator, a constructed version of Chaucer himself, is first discovered staying at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, in London, when a company of 29 people descend on the inn, preparing to go on a pilgrimage to Canterbury. After talking to them, he agrees to join them on their pilgrimage. 11 Yet before the narrator goes any further in the tale, he describes the circumstances and the social rank of each pilgrim. He describes each one in turn, starting with the highest status individuals. The knight is described first, as befits a worthy man of high status. The knight has fought in the Crusades in numerous countries, and always been honored for his worthiness and courtesy. Everywhere he went, the narrator tells us, he had a sovereign prize, which could mean either an outstanding reputation, or a price on his head for the fighting he has done. The knight is dressed in a fustian tunic, made of coarse cloth, which is stained by the rust from his coat of chain mail. The knight brings with him his son, the squire, a lover, and a lusty bachelor, only 20 years old. The squire cuts a rather effeminate figure, his clothes embroidered with red and white flowers, and he is constantly singing or playing the flute. He is the only pilgrim, other than, of course, Chaucer himself, who explicitly has literary ambitions. He whose songs make and well indite, line 95. The yeoman, a freeborn servant, also travels along with the knight's entourage, and is clad in coat and hood of green. The yeoman is excellent at caring for arrows, and travels armed with a huge amount of weaponry, arrows, a bracer, arm guard, a sword, a buckler, and a dagger as sharp as a spear. He wears an image of Saint Christopher on his breast. Having now introduced the knight, the highest-ranking pilgrim socially, the narrator now moves on to the clergy, beginning with the prioress, called a Madame Eglantine, or, in modern parlance, Mrs. Sweetbriar. She could sweetly sing religious services, speaks fluent French, and has excellent table manners. She is so charitable and piteous, that she would weep if she saw a mouse caught in a trap, and she has 2 small dogs with her. She wears a brooch with the inscription, Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. The prioress brings with her her chapelain, secretary, the second nun. The monk is next, an extremely fine and handsome man who loves to hunt, and who follows modern customs rather than old traditions. This is no bookish monk, studying in a cloister, but a man who keeps greyhounds to hunt the hare. The monk is well fed, fat, and his eyes are bright, gleaming like a furnace in his head. The friar who follows him is also wanton and merry, and he is a limiteur by trade, a friar licensed to beg in certain districts. He is extremely well beloved of franklins, landowners, and worthy women all over the town. He hears confession and gives absolution, and is an excellent beggar, able to earn himself a farthing wherever he went. His name is Hubert. The merchant wears a forked beard, motley clothes, and sat high upon his horse. He gives his opinion very solemnly, and does excellent business as a merchant, never being in any debt. But, the narrator ominously remarks, I note how men hymk, I don't know how men call him, or think of him. The clerk follows the merchant. A student of Oxford University, he would rather have 20 books by Aristotle than rich clothes or musical instruments, and thus is dressed in a threadbare short coat. He only has a little gold, which he tends to spend on books 12 and learning, and takes huge care and attention of his studies. He never speaks a word more than is needed, and that is short, quick and full of sentence. The Middle English word for meaningfulness is a close relation of sententiousness. The man of law, referred to here as a sergeant of the law, is a judicious and dignified man, or, at least, he seems so because of his wise words. He is a judge in the court of assizes, by letter of appointment from the king, and because of his high standing receives many grants. He can draw up a legal document, the narrator tells us, and no one can find a flaw in his legal writings. Yet, despite all this money and social worth, the man of law rides only in a homely, multicolored coat. A franklin travels with the man of law. He has a beard as white as a daisy, and of the sanguine humor, dominated by his blood. The franklin is a big eater, loving a piece of bread dipped in wine, and is described, though not literally, as Epicurus' son. The franklin lives for culinary delight. His house is always full of meat pie, fish and meat, so much so that it snewed in his hoos of meat and drink. He changes his meats and drinks according to what foods are in season. A haberdasher and a carpenter, a weaver, a dyer and a tapicer, weaver of tapestries, are next described, all of them clothed in the same distinctive guildsman's dress. Note that none of these pilgrims, in the end, actually tell a tale. A cook had been brought along to boil the chicken up with marrow bones and spices, but this particular cook knows a draught of ale very well indeed, according to the narrator. The cook could roast and simmer and boil and fry, make stews and hashes and bake a pie well, but it was a great pity that, on his shin, he has an ulcer. A shipman from Dartmouth is next, tanned brown from the hot summer sun, riding upon a cart horse, and wearing a gown of coarse woolen cloth which reaches to his knees. The shipman had, many times, drawn a secret draught of wine on board ship, while the merchant was asleep. The shipman has weathered many storms, and knows his trade. He knows the locations of all the harbours from Gotland to Cape Finisterre. His shape is called the Maud Lane. A doctor of medicine is the next pilgrim described, clad in red and blue, and no one in the world can match him in speaking about medicine and surgery. He knows the cause of every illness, what humour engenders them, and how to cure them. He is a perfect practitioner of medicine, and he has apothecaries ready to send him drugs and mixtures. He is well read in the standard medical authorities, from the Greeks right through to Chaucer's contemporary Gilbertus Anglicus. The doctor, however, has not studied the Bible. The wife of Bath was sondel deaf, a little deaf, as her tale will later expand upon, and that was a shame. The wife of Bath is so adept at making cloth that she surpasses even the cloth-making capitals of Chaucer's world, Ypres and Ghent, and she wears coverchiefs, linen coverings for the head, which must, the narrator assumes, have weighed in 10 pounds. She had had 5 husbands through the church door, and had been at Jerusalem, Rome and Boulogne on pilgrimage. She is also described as Gatoft, traditionally denoting lasciviousness, and as keeping good company. She knows all the 13 answers about love, for she could have that art the oldie dance. She knew the whole dance as far as love is concerned. A good religious man, a parson of a town, is next described, who, although poor in goods, is rich in holy thought and work. He is a learned man, who truly preaches Christ's gospel, and devoutly teaches his parishioners. He travels across his big parish to visit all of his parishioners, on his feet, carrying a staff in his hand. He is a noble example to his parishioners, his sheep, as they are described, because he acts first, and preaches second, or, in Chaucer's phrase, first he wrote, and afterward he taught. The narrator believes that there is no better priest to be found anywhere. With the parson travels a ploughman, who does not tell a tale, who has hauled many cartloads of dung in his time. He is a good, hard-working man, who lives in peace and charity, and treats his neighbour as he would be treated. He rides on a mare, and wears a tabard, a workman's loose garment. A miller comes next, in this final group of pilgrims, now at the bottom of the class scale. He is big-boned and has big muscles, and always wins the prize in wrestling matches. There's not a door that he couldn't lift off its hinges, or break it by running at it head first. He has black, wide nostrils, carries a sword and a buckler, shield, by his side, and has a mouth like a great furnace. He's good at stealing corn and taking payment for it 3 times. But then, Chaucer implies, there are no honest millers. A noble manciple, a business agent, purchaser of religious provisions, is the next pilgrim to be described, and a savvy financial operator. Though a common man, the manciple can run rings round even a heap of learned men. The manciple, his description ominously ends, set her a la cap, deceived them all. The reeve, a slender, choleric man, long-legged and lean, ylyk a staff. He knows exactly how much grain he has, and is excellent at keeping his granary and his grain bin. There is no bailiff, herdsman or servant about whom the reeve does not know something secret or treacherous. As a result, they are afraid of him as of the deef. The summoner is next, his face fire-red and pimpled, with narrow eyes. He has a skin disease across his black brows, and his beard, which has hair falling out of it, and he is extremely lecherous. There is, the narrator tells us, no ointment or cure, or help him to remove his pimples. He loves drinking wine which is as red as blood, and eating leeks, onions, and garlic. He knows how to trick someone. Travelling with the summoner is a noble pardoner, his friend and his companion. In what sense Chaucer intends the word compe, meaning companion, nobody knows, and the last pilgrim teller to be described. He sings loudly, "Come hither, love to me," and has hair as yellow as wax, which hangs like flaxen from his head. He carries a wallet full of pardons in his lap, brimful of pardons come from Rome. The pardoner is sexually ambiguous, He has a thin, boyish voice, and the narrator wonders whether he is a gelding or a mare, a eunuch or a homosexual. The narrator writes that he has told us now of the estate, the class, the array, the clothing, and the number of pilgrims assembled in this company. He then makes an important statement of intent for what is to come. He who repeats a tale told by another 14 man, the narrator says, must repeat it as closely as he possibly can to the original teller, and thus, if the tellers use obscene language, it is not our narrator's fault. The host is the last member of the company described, a large man with bright, large eyes, and an extremely fair man. The host welcomes everyone to the inn, and announces the pilgrimage to Canterbury, and decides that, on the way there, the company shall talon and play, to tell stories and amuse themselves. Everyone consents to the host's plan for the game, and he then goes on to set it out. What the host describes is a tale-telling game, in which each pilgrim shall tell 2 tales on the way to Canterbury, and 2 more on the way home. Whoever tells the tale of best sentence and most solace shall have supper at the cost of all of the other pilgrims, back at the inn, once the pilgrimage returns from Canterbury. The pilgrims agree to the host's suggestion, and agree to accord to the host's judgment as master of the tale-telling game. Everyone then goes to bed. The next morning, the host awakes, raises everyone up, and in a flock the pilgrimage rides towards the watering of St. Thomas, a brook about 2 miles from London. The host asks the pilgrims to draw lots to see who shall tell the first tale, the knight being asked to draw cut first and, whether by aventure, or sword, or cas, the knight draws the straw to tell the first tale. The pilgrims ride forward, and the knight begins to tell his tale. Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Analysis. The general prologue was probably written early in the composition of the Canterbury Tales, and offers an interesting comparison point to many of the individual tales itself. Of course, it does not match up,